When a disaster happens, it becomes news around the globe. Whether it's the scale or the spectacle.
Look at the debris. Look at all the debris. Look at all the debris in the air.
The financial cost or the lives lost. These massive events fill mankind with fascination and fear. In this series, we're looking at some of the biggest disasters to ever strike the planet.
Before the levee broke this morning, this whole area was already flooded. It's about a 6-block.
For the next hour, we'll see what happens when the lifeblood of the planet is unleashed. Water. It covers 2/3 of the planet and makes up 60% of the human body. But when it's uncontained, it's absolutely devastating, flowing faster than you can run, hitting with the power of a train, and inundating everything that isn't airtight. Head for higher ground because today, we're looking at the top 10 floods of all time. The blue planet. Even though we call our planet Earth, it's really mostly water. The blue planet's peaceful-sounding nickname comes from its most essential resource. It covers 71% of it. In liquid form, it fills oceans and lakes and flows through rivers and streams. Much of it exists as ice and as vapor in the atmosphere, and it never stops moving. Its endless cycle of evaporation to water vapor, to cloud formation, to rain, keeps everything on the planet alive. But water, by its force and its speed, can be transformed, in certain circumstances, into real terror. Torrential rains or a river breaching its banks can turn this essential resource into a deadly and destructive trap. To classify the 10 worst floods that marked the planet, we study the human, environmental, and financial toll of these disasters that have occurred throughout history and around the world. Let's start right away with the one that holds the 10th place in our ranking. We head to Brazil, and more precisely, the region of Minas Gerais, in the southeast of the country. It was here in the city of Mariana that a terrible disaster took place in 2015. Mariana is a town of just over 50,000 inhabitants. Since the 17th century, it's been known for its precious stone deposits and has become the El Dorado of the mining industry. Among the players is the company Samarco, owned by the Brazilian giant Vale, and the Anglo-Australian BHP. The company built the Fundo Dam outside the city, which began operation in 2008. Its function? To store the millions of cubic meters of toxic castings generated by the operation of a nearby iron mine. But on November 5, 2015, the dam collapsed. More than 40 million tons of toxic mud pour over the region. Houses, cattle, farms. The torrent of sludge carries away everything in its path. The little village of Bento Rodrigues is wiped off the map in just a few hours. The wake of the tragedy leaves 19 dead, including several children. The toxic torrent pours into the water of the Doce River, killing millions of fish and destroying hundreds of hectares of forest as it spreads. The poisonous wave of waste sweeps nearly 650 kilometers through 2 Brazilian states, polluting everything along its unstoppable course. Experts estimate that it will take more than 20 years to clean up such an ecological disaster. The investigation reveals that an internal report had sounded the alarm a few years earlier on the risk of the dam collapsing, but at the time, the company management chose not to act. The mining giants Vale and BHP, owners of the Samarco company responsible for the disaster, were ordered to pay several $billions to clean up the region and compensate the victims. but the impact of this toxic flood still seems almost irreversible today.
A Polícia Militar de Meio Ambiente fiscalizou a mineradora há 2 anos e não encontrou problemas na barragem.
Unfortunately, this horrific event did not even serve as a lesson. Just 4 years later, on January 25, 2019, the Brumadinho Dam, located in the same state and belonging to the Brazilian giant Vale, still involved in the Mariana disaster, also collapsed, leaving 270 dead and a new ecological disaster. These 2 tragedies could undoubtedly have been avoided had the mining companies not been so negligent. Since then, an international investigation has listed 5 other mining dams in danger of collapsing. The future of the region depends on the maintenance work of these potential time bombs. To investigate the flood that takes 9th place in our ranking, we're heading to the United States where, in 1927, the Mississippi River was the source of one of the most dramatic floods in history. The Mississippi is the 2nd longest river in all of North America. It flows from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico over more than 3,700 kilometers, and in some places, it exceeds 18 kilometers wide. Its course is lined with many floodplains, which are flat areas lying close to the banks of the river that naturally flood when the water level rises. That's not a bad thing. The frequent phenomenon provides beneficial consequences. In these places, the soil is regularly enriched with minerals deposited when the floodwaters recede. Floodplains are places often very rich in biodiversity and where people come to settle to take advantage of this abundance of resources. But during the winter of 1926 to 1927, the plains of the Mississippi were inundated with rain. For several months, the rain continued to fall incessantly. The relentless influx of water overwhelmed the dikes built along the river to protect the surrounding communities. On April 15, 1927, torrential rains filled the bloated Mississippi beyond its maximum capacity. They triggered one of the 20th century's most tragic floods. At the time, more than 1 million people lived in the floodplains of the Mississippi. Within just a few hours, they would be flooded out. In some areas, the water level reaches up to 10 meters high, as tall as a 3-story house. The total flooded area is gigantic, more than 70,000 square kilometers of land, equal to the entire surface of Ireland. In some places, the width of the river expands to more than 130 kilometers. From Illinois in the north to Louisiana in the south, all the plains of the Mississippi are underwater. The impact of this record flood will last for 2 years. It is estimated that, in today's figures, it caused several tens of billions of dollars in damage. It's a figure that would have washed most countries into bankruptcy.
Then, with appalling suddenness, came the beginning of the greatest depression of all time.
In the United States, its impact on agriculture and the economy is so severe that some experts say it was one of the triggering factors of the Great Depression that brought America to its knees between 1929 and 1933. The tragedy also had far-reaching social and cultural consequences. The refugees had to be housed for months in emergency camps. At the time, segregation was the rule in the country, and inside the camps, while the whites have the right to come and go, the African Americans find themselves separated and treated like prisoners. The situation will push many African Americans into exile to the north, profoundly changing American society in the 20th century and beyond. The reported death toll of this terrible flood was 500 lives. While the figure seems mercifully low, the gigantic economic and social impact of the Great Mississippi Flood makes it one of the most significant natural disasters in history.
Before the levee broke this morning, this whole area was already flooded. It's about a 6-block area in Hardin. That means about 170 families have had to be evacuated.
More than 65 years later, in 1993, another dramatic flood hit the region following torrential rains, this time in autumn. The entire basin of the Mississippi River and its tributaries, including the Missouri River, will again be underwater.
Up and down the length of Missouri, there are more than 120 levees protecting towns, homes, and farmland from the swollen Mississippi River.
This time, 50 people are reported dead, and the damage is estimated at more than $15 billion. Proof, once again, that nothing can stand in the way of the flooding of a river such as the Great Mississippi.
Surrounding areas so quickly.
After the United States, we head to Asia to relive the disaster that takes 8th place in our ranking. In 2013, tragedy struck the Indian state of Uttarakhand, located in the north of the country and crossed by the Himalayan range. Torrential rains aren't unusual here. They're triggered by a climatic phenomenon that affects the country every year between June and September, known as monsoon season. It's also the season when pilgrims of various religions travel to the state of Uttarakhand, the source of the sacred rivers of the Ganges and the Yamuna. At this time of year, the population swells by 300,000 people, increasing the magnitude of the cataclysm that struck Uttarakhand in June 2013. Between June 15th and 16th, precipitation reaches 10 centimeters of rain per hour. Waterspouts suddenly descend on the region. The abrupt rise in water is more than the area can bear. Because the region sits at the foot of the Himalayas, rain on the mountainside floods down onto the ground below, adding to the inundation. And it isn't just the precipitation. As the powerful pounding rain hits the peaks of the mountain, it melts the snowcap and the glaciers, magnifying the catastrophe. In this flash flood, millions of cubic meters of rain and meltwater race down the mountainside and into the valley at high speed toward the vulnerable villages below. This monsoon season, the rainfall increased by 375% compared to normal. Worse, at the time, several hydroelectric dams were under construction in the area. Huge blocks of rock extracted from the construction sites and abandoned on the sides of the mountains are washed away by the waves of water. They tumble down the mountain and smash into the defenseless houses in the valley. Anything in the path of the torrents of debris pouring down from the peaks is destroyed. The trees are uprooted. Houses are washed away. Roads, bridges, and railroads are buried. Besides the raging water and pounding rocks, the fast-flowing water triggers gigantic landslides, which destroy everything the rain hasn't already carried away. Then there's the human cost, as tens of thousands of pilgrims find themselves trapped. When the water finally subsides, a full measure of the destruction can be tallied. The monsoon leaves 6,000 dead and thousands homeless. The bodies washed away by the flood will be found several weeks later, miles away. Their decomposing corpses will lead to the spread of disease and pollute drinking water resources, further increasing the number of victims. The tragedy continues to haunt the surviving inhabitants, but for them, the nightmare is far from over and history can repeat. Climate change has already wrought consequences on the region, accelerating the ice melt in the Himalayas. And the next torrential rains that fall on Uttarakhand could well trigger a new disaster, even more destructive. After India, we head to Italy to discover one of Europe's most dramatic flooding events of the 20th century. It took place in 1963 in the former province of Pordenone in the northeast of the country. It is here that a gigantic project, the ill-conceived Vajont Dam, was built, a colossal construction erected between two steep mountains. The dam was intended to block the course of a river to create a new reservoir upstream of the dam. Built between 1956 and 1960 at the foot of Mont Toc, the work overlooks a valley where the village of Longarone and its 4,000 inhabitants were located. At the time, the 266-meter-high Vajont was the highest dam in the world, and it was the pride of the whole country, except that what the designers hadn't anticipated was that the two sides of the mountains on which it rested were not completely stable. On October 9, 1963, at precisely 10:39 p.m., as the inhabitants of the valley below are preparing to go to bed, all hell breaks loose. A gigantic landslide is triggered on the side of the mountain. In a flash, 260 million cubic meters of water flow into the reservoir all at once. The equivalent of more than 500 million tons of rock roar down the 140-meter-long slope at colossal speed. The dam's sudden collapse triggers a wave nearly 150 meters high. The onslaught is similar to a tsunami passing over the ruptured dam, a wall of water taller than the Statue of Liberty or the Pyramid of Cheops. Absolutely no one is prepared.
One of the most horrifying disasters in Italian history, a flood that roared down from the Vajont Dam and decimated a valley.
The villages of Longarone, Pirago, Villanova, Rivalta, and Fay are wiped off the map. The cataclysm lasts barely 15 minutes. Result, more than 2,000 dead and hundreds of homes destroyed. The government dispatches 2,000 soldiers to help the rescue teams. Despite their efforts, the bodies of hundreds of victims will never be found. The investigation will later show that the disaster was entirely preventable, and that the geology of the area should have prohibited the authorities from building a dam there. At this location, the sides of the mountains had been formed by successive landslides over the course of millennia, rendering it inherently unstable. And between each layer of rock was a layer of loose clay just 10 centimeters thick. The dam with this new reservoir gradually saturated the mountainsides with water, inevitably weakening the soil. From the beginning, the question was not whether the ground would collapse, but when. Following the disaster, the area was permanently obstructed by a gigantic hill, reaching 850 meters high, preventing the river from flowing at the level of the dam. The collapse deviated the course of the river so that it flows into a valley further to the east. Since then, the town of Longarone has been completely rebuilt. As for the Vajont Dam, it still stands between the two walls of mountain and has been transformed into a place of remembrance in memory of those who lost their lives on that day in October 1963. After Italy, let's head back to Asia and, more specifically, to Japan. to discover the disaster which takes 6th place in our ranking. It occurred in 2011 when a terrible earthquake hit the Pacific coast of the Tohoku region. Tsunamis are among the most destructive events on the planet. They are triggered when a massive amount of water is suddenly displaced by a landslide, volcanic eruption, or underwater earthquake. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 p.m., a terrible earthquake of magnitude 9.1 was triggered 130 kilometers offshore and about 29 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. It was the 4th most powerful earthquake ever recorded on Earth. So powerful that it changed the axis of rotation of the Earth and shifted the main island of Japan, Honshu, more than 2 meters toward the east.
Quite simply, the biggest, longest-lasting earthquake I've ever experienced here.
In an instant, the earthquake displaced billions of tons of water, causing the formation of huge waves that raced ahead at more than 800 kilometers per hour, about as fast as an airliner. The first waves, some 40 meters high, slammed the Japanese coast 30 minutes after the earthquake. They completely overwhelmed the anti-tsunami dikes built on the island to protect the land from these sea monsters. The surging water sweeps away absolutely everything. The waves toss cars and trucks around like toys, turning them into battering rams that smash into homes and buildings, creating even more damage. The energy of the tsunami is such that on the other side of the ocean, waves reach the coast of Chile, more than 17,000 kilometers away. Even at that distance, they measure more than 2 meters high, an unimaginable power. In Japan, more than 100,000 buildings are annihilated, and 1 million are badly damaged in just a few minutes. And while hundreds of thousands of Japanese people try desperately to survive in and around their homes, another drama begins to play out at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The facilities have been designed to withstand tsunamis, but no one anticipated a tsunami event of such incredible magnitude. The giant wave deactivated the nuclear reactor's cooling systems.
Uncharted territory, we are thinking the unthinkable. Think of a car, out of control, without brakes. And then your radiator.
As authorities work to immediately evacuate the residents of the towns nearby the nuclear power plant, some Fukushima employees fight to prevent the reactors from melting down. The stage is set for a nuclear disaster even more serious than that of Chernobyl. The consequences threaten the entire planet. 3 reactors collapse and several explosions occur at the site. But the heroes of Fukushima managed to prevent the destruction of the reactors.
Since then, officials say that while the Fukushima plant continues to spew radioactive isotopes, emissions are down sharply.
As for the floods triggered by this giant tsunami, they ring up a death toll of more than 15,000 people. The damage is estimated at more than $450 billion. This was a disaster the world won't soon forget. Let's head now to South America to discover the event that earns the 5th place in our ranking. It was a terrible flood that struck the Venezuelan state of Guaira, known at the time as the state of Vargas. The region borders the Caribbean Sea, and most of the cities of the state are located on the coast. The densely populated area, with more than 300,000 inhabitants, is regularly hit by floods, so it's a situation that the people living there have more or less come to expect. But what happened at the end of 1999 defied expectations. The season turned out to be exceptionally rainy. Starting in November, weeks of torrential rains fall continuously, and on December 14th, while the inhabitants are experiencing their 37th consecutive day of rain, a violent storm strikes the region. The state of Vargas is hit with a year's worth of rain in just 3 days. In barely 52 hours, nearly 1 meter of rain pours down over the already saturated ground. With nowhere for the water to go, rivers overflow, and the areas along the banks are completely swamped. The storm also triggers thousands of landslides, loading the flooding rivers with debris. As the water mixes with mud, tree trunks, rock, and anything and everything else, it creates a destructive flash flood at nearly 50 kilometers per hour that nothing can resist. Hundreds of vehicles and homes are swept away. Surprised by the speed and magnitude of the event, the Venezuelan authorities have no time to order evacuations, and many residents stay home, thinking they are safe, just waiting for the deluge to stop. Their decision proves fatal for most of them. One by one, muddy mountains slide into the sea in wave after wave that swallows the inhabited areas along the coast. Huge swaths of coastal towns are wiped off the map in an instant. Buildings get washed out to sea or simply buried under a 3-meter thick layer of mud.
Entire towns have been swallowed up by the mud, and many victims are believed to be buried under it all.
Most of the roads and bridges are destroyed, and 96 kilometers of coastline devastated. Damage was estimated at more than $3 billion. The human toll is estimated at 30,000 dead, but only 1,000 bodies will be found. The others, entombed by mud or swept irretrievably out to sea, makes the exact number of victims of the Vargas disaster unknowable. In the aftermath, many residents pin the blame for the catastrophe on the government, and especially on President Hugo Chavez. At the time, Chavez had been president for just 10 months, and the country was in the middle of an election to change the constitution. Some will accuse the authorities of focusing more on the election than on the evacuation of the inhabitants threatened by the floods. The drama demonstrated how unprepared the Venezuelan authorities were to deal with such a disaster. But the events of December 1999 in the state of Vargas are above all terrible and relentless proof that with or without prior planning, nothing can stand in the way of a flood of such magnitude. After South America, let's hop over to Africa. The flood that takes 4th place in our ranking covers more than a single country and spans more than a single event. It concerns almost the entire Sub-Saharan Africa. The phenomenon is considered by some to be one of the worst natural disasters of all time.
97 tulikuwa huku ya Rinino ilikuwa, Rinino ingine imekuja, Rinino ingine imekuja, na tujaiona maneno kama hizi.
Most countries on the African continent are subject to a recurrent cycle of droughts and floods. These events have always had an impact on the population, but they have also enabled people to survive in arid areas. Because, after a period without precipitation, the rain is essential to replenish the water tables and recharge the soil with minerals essential for agriculture. But the climate change unfolding during the 20th century has drastically changed the equation, and Africa is experiencing a succession of events with increasingly catastrophic consequences. Over the past 40 years, the continent has been hit by 3 times as many droughts, 4 times as many storms, and worse, 10 times more flooding than ever before. And when heavy rains fall on an arid zone, the consequences for the inhabitants are terrible. Because in these regions, the earth can't absorb the sudden inundation of so much water. Worse, excessive deforestation for agriculture and livestock has only intensified the already dire situation. Without trees, the soil becomes even more vulnerable to erosion, and the risk of landslides increases considerably. The grinding poverty of many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa amplifies the misery of each event. It is estimated today that 70 million people living in extreme poverty conditions are threatened by recurrent risks of flooding. And when floods strike, the inhabitants can lose what little they have in an instant. Today, studies show that this extreme weather is caused by climate change. A pattern emerging is one of the rising temperatures compounded by the increasing frequency of extreme rainfall events. Sub-Saharan Africa has also seen an overall decrease of rain during the rainy season, meaning prolonged droughts. The situation is only getting worse. Over the past 20 years, more than a dozen countries in Africa have been hit by the worst floods in recent history. These disasters have already victimized thousands of people, but the events to come threaten tens of millions more. The damage has already been assessed at several $billion. The tragedy of these successive floods in Africa has only just begun.
Both Chinese and Japanese are accused of causing the breach, but the Yellow River has a way of breaking its own banks. Here is an actual gap with water streaming through.
After Africa, let's return to Asia to witness the event that earned 3rd place in the ranking of the worst floods in history. It took place in China in 1938, in the heart of Henan province.
A new spirit of unity animates ancient China.
By the end of the 1930s, China had been plunged into a bloody civil war for more than a decade. Country is divided in two. Part of the population is under the control of the official nationalist government, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. The rest is controlled by local lords, or Chinese Communist Party insurgents. Meanwhile, Japan, aware of the chaos that reigns in its neighbor, sees an opportunity and invades China. In 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War begins. From the month of August, the Japanese Imperial Army quickly seizes the main cities of the country. The fighting is incredibly violent, and in June 1938, Japan already wins control of northern China. Seemingly unstoppable, Japanese troops continue to advance through the heart of Henan province on their way to Wuhan, one of the largest cities in the region. Pushed to the brink, Chiang Kai-shek make a rash and cataclysmic decision.
Now, as the Japs advanced on Chengchao, the Chinese blew up the southern dike of the Yellow River.
He orders troops to deliberately destroy the dikes that hold back the Yellow River near the city of Jiangsu. The Yellow River crosses from east to west, north of the province of Henan. It is the 6th longest river in the world, and at the time, its flow rate was 14,000 cubic meters per second, enough to fill 5 Olympic swimming pools every second. The rupture of the dikes will trigger a catastrophic flood over the entire western part of the province. The raging flood fills the valley, leaving nothing in its wake. From a military perspective, Chiang Kai-shek's decision made it possible to slow the Japanese troops and give the Chinese troops time to withdraw and reorganize. But in human terms, the disaster didn't differentiate between soldiers and civilians. The inhabitants of Henan province will be the collateral victims of the Chinese leaders' brutal strategy.
Work not of armies, but of nature. The Yellow River is in flood, driving hundreds of thousands from their homes and delaying the Japanese advance.
As the torrent of water cuts a path through the valley floor, it floods a huge area. In some places, the width of the river exceeds 64 kilometers, and the average depth of 2 meters makes all the infrastructure in the region impassable.
So another migration is underway of villagers seeking dry land.
More than 90% of villages in Fugo County are wiped out. Much of the agricultural land is submerged, covered in a thick layer of silt that will make it unfit for cultivation for several years. Over the next few weeks, the flooding will spread, and faced with the power of the waters, other dikes will give way in turn. In total, more than 130,000 square kilometers of land will be buried under the waters. Chiang Kai-shek's ruthless maneuver is still considered one of the worst military decisions in history. The exact toll is impossible to count, but some estimate it at 900,000 dead, most of them civilians.
Heartrending is the rescue of a lone survivor whose family has been swept away by the...
Millions of inhabitants who survived the flood will find themselves homeless, forced to take refuge in makeshift camps, where epidemics and famine increase the number of victims. It will take a decade for the Yellow River to regain its original course. But the landscapes of the region will never be the same as it was. The damage caused by this disaster can never be fully quantified. The consequences for the population and for the country are simply unprecedented. There is truly no other intentionally caused catastrophe that can even come close to Chiang Kai-shek's order to flood the Yellow River in 1938. Here is a record flood triggered by a single man who was willing to sacrifice his own people to buy a little time in a war he was losing. It's the most senseless act of war in history.
The clock frozen at 8:30. The time, the date, the year. Indonesia will never forget.
We'll stay in Asia to explore the event that takes second place in our ranking. We head to Indonesia, where a cataclysmic tsunami struck the coast in 2004.
Good evening. More than 11,000 people are now thought to have been killed in southern Asia after an undersea earthquake sent enormous waves rolling across the Indian Ocean.
Earthquake struck, the two plates collided.
It all started on the morning of December 26, 2004.
The effect was felt right across the ocean, generating...
An otherwise ordinary day turns to terror as seismographs detect a magnitude 9.1 earthquake just 160 kilometers off the coast of Sumatra. After Chile in 1960 and Alaska in 1964, this is the third most powerful earthquake ever recorded. It releases energy equal to 20,000 Hiroshima bombs. The power of the earthquake is so ferocious that it temporarily alters the rotation of the Earth. The tremors are felt within a radius of several thousand kilometers. For 10 long minutes, the Earth will shake and the seabed will tear apart over an area nearly 1,000 kilometers long. The tremors instantly trigger giant waves that break in all directions, and especially on the coasts of the Indonesian islands. For inhabited areas located on the edge of the ocean, the consequences are apocalyptic. Indonesian authorities knew a tsunami was coming. They'd been alerted by the anti-tsunami surveillance system, an array of buoys designed for early detection. They raced to send out an alert, but their frantic attempts to warn the population by text messages come to nothing. Most of their warnings never reach their destination because the earthquake destroyed their telecommunications systems. Residents of Banda Aceh province are the first to be affected by the tsunami, just 20 minutes after the quake struck off the coast. Waves 30 meters high slam the area and race more than 3 kilometers inland. Anything less than 20 meters high is submerged by the raging waters. In the space of a few minutes, nearly 100,000 people lose their lives. But the disaster is far from finished. The devastation in Sumatra is just the prelude. An hour later, the gigantic waves of death that race across the Indian Ocean at 800 kilometers per hour hit the Thai islands and wipe out several seaside resorts, killing more than 5,000 people. 30 minutes later, more than 2,400 kilometers away, the waves reach Sri Lanka and devastate 800 kilometers of coastline. Homes, hotels, anything near the edge of the water is razed in an instant, along with the loss of 30,000 human lives. And the devastation isn't done. Minutes later, it's India's turn to be hit by the tsunami, which claims another 16,000 victims.
No life here will never be the same again.
The tsunami's awesome power is still not spent. It has one more deadly stop to make. Over 8 hours, it travels more than 8,000 kilometers to the coast of South Africa, where it swamps a group of swimmers. And then, at last, it withdraws.
The waves killing at least 500 in this fishing village near Cuddalore. These people have lost everything: their homes, their livelihoods, and their families.
Wherever a tsunami strikes, the cycle is the same. First, a super powerful wave devastates everything in its path, followed by another that loads up with debris to cause even more damage.
We've seen so many bodies here, but this is the only one we've seen having any sort of funeral rites.
9 hours after the earthquake, the toll of this terrible disaster will report 225,000 dead in 14 countries over a radius of more than 8,000 kilometers. Carried away by the waters, many bodies of victims will never be found. Tens of thousands of buildings and untold amounts of infrastructure were destroyed. The extent of the damage is almost impossible to quantify. In all, nearly a quarter of the planet was impacted by the tsunami of December 26, 2004. Terrible proof that when the ocean unleashes its rage, nothing can hold it back.
Now, as the Japs advanced on Chengchao, the Chinese blew up the southern dike of the Yellow River.
Our ranking of the planet's 10 worst floods has already taken us to China in the late 1930s, when the country's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, had the dikes of the Yellow River destroyed in 1938, causing the death of several 100,000 people.
The Japanese advance.
The city of Hankou now underwater.
And now we return to China to discover the watery event that takes the terrible ranking of first place in our countdown. The disaster occurred just 7 years before the Yellow River disaster in 1931. It hit Hubei province, and it surpasses anything we have seen so far.
The Chinese armies valiantly defended their city.
At the time, China is already in the throes of a brutal civil war, and the official Chinese government is battling against the communists. The war leads to a worrying depletion of resources and is ravaging the country's economy. Too busy fighting and in dire need of funds, the government unwisely decides not to carry out the work needed to prevent the risk of flooding of the Yangtze River, which crosses the country from east to west. At 6,380 kilometers, it is the longest river in China, the third longest river in the world. But the winter of 1931 is particularly brutal. The snow never seems to stop, and a thick blanket of it quickly smothers the sides of the mountains that surrounded the city of Wuhan, capital of Hubei province. In the winter, it's not a problem. But when the spring thaw comes, the situation begins to get a little worrying. Snow melt quickly overflows the Yangtze River, and the first floods infiltrate areas near the river. Things grow more dire by summer. In July 1931, nature proved to be merciless. 8 cyclones successively hit the region in barely 1 month. Then continuous rainfall triggers the worst flood in history. 60 centimeters of water pour into the region in less than 30 days, causing the smallest dike in the river to burst. The floodwaters submerge thousands of square kilometers of land. It destroys the crops. It wipes out the grain reserves. But the worst is yet to come. The floods destroy the walls protecting the city of Wuhan, at the time one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. With nothing to slow it down, the invading wall of water sweeps through the city, destroying everything in its path and killing thousands of people. And as the calamity plunges Wuhan into chaos, the rain continues unabated, and the high-speed floods keep coming. At the peak of the flood, the water submerges more than 180,000 square kilometers of land. That's an area equal to all of England and a large part of Scotland. In some areas, the water will rise to 16 meters above its usual level. Entire towns are completely submerged, as if erased from the surface of the earth. The rainfall and the rising of the Yangtze River are so immense that the floods spread to cover a large part of the country and cause most other Chinese rivers to overflow, further intensifying the damage and the number of victims.
Strange caravans plod wearily on to safety in the unflooded highlands. Broken lives with days of utter horror.
It is now estimated that more than 50 million people were displaced by the floods. For several weeks, food supplies would be scarce for the survivors, and water supplies would remain polluted with sewage for a long time. Famine and disease made the 1931 floods in China the greatest natural disaster of the 20th century. The total toll is still debated, but most experts estimate it at 3.7 million dead. It's difficult to say if these apocalyptic floods might have been prevented or reduced, if the Chinese government had carried out the work essential to protect the populations who lived along the banks of the Yangtze River.
Altogether, 1 million people have lost their homes. 100,000 have lost their lives.
But what is certain is that to date, no other natural event has cost so many human lives.
Disasters in Italian history. A flood that roared down from the Vajont Dam and decimated a valley. Best estimates put the toll at 1,800.
These are powerful images of the worst floods in history that prove to what extent nature picks its battles and plays by its own unchanging, indifferent rules. And while water is essential to life, when faced with the terrible damage caused by these disasters and the number of victims they left behind, the conclusion is clear. Nothing can thwart the devastating power of water. Our past is punctuated by tragedies that have traumatized entire generations around the world. But our future doesn't look much different. We are already threatened by climate change and the increase of extreme weather events. Wherever we are in the world, we must find out how to better predict floods and to learn to anticipate and deal with them. Because, let's face it, water always wins.